As I mentioned, he had written a book, Aryan, the RIGVEDIC people, invaders, immigrants, or indigenous. This book is about a part of that whole book. But as I said, it was intended for those people who are Hindi-speaking belt, and hence it is in Hindi. The chapter 1 describes the Indo-European language and the people talking about it, the ones that I've already spoken to you about. Chapter 2 talks about the congruency of RIGVEDIC people and the Harappan civilization. I'll tell you how it is. Like if you recall, the Harappan civilization on the east was spread to Ganga, Yamuna, Doab, and continued west right up to river Indus. Its mature period being 2500 BCE. So we can safely say that the Harappan civilization was in the third millennium and spread between Ganga on the east and Indus on the west. Now, when Professor Lal was excavating Kalibanga, in which he found it was a pre-Harappan and medieval Harappan setup, he wanted to find out how this civilization decayed. And he got a group of geologists and hydrologists led by an Italian, Robert Rakes, to dig wells in the Ghaggar. As you're aware, Ghaggar is the new name or the recent modern name for the old Saraswati. And the team found out that this Saraswati dried up in 2000 BCE. If you're aware, the Rigved has mentioned a mighty flowing river called Saraswati, starting from Himalayan glacier right down to the ocean. And this mighty river mentioned 75 times, but decayed in 2000. It very safely to say that it was a mighty flowing river, so to speak, around middle of 3rd millennium BC. What does Rigved say about its people? Allow me to read this Rigvedic Mandal 10, Sukt 75, verses 5 and 6, which describe the spread of Rigvedic people. O Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, Shatudri, which is Satluj, and Parushni, Rabi, they're going into from east to west. Rabi, Chenab, and Jhelum. It says the Ras and the Shwed, that is Swat, and thereafter Parushni, Madhuvrita and Asekani, which is Chenab, and Vitasta, Jhelum, and Sushumna, Sohan. Please listen to and accept this hymn of mine. O Sindhu, flowing, and then the hymn talks about the various tributaries of river Indus, and then he says, finally you move on to the same chariot as them. So here again, if you notice, they are talking about Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, Shatudri, right onto Sindhu, that is Indus. And this Rigvedic people of 3rd millennium BC is proved, and the Harappan civilization also of 3rd millennium BC, the east and the southern east and the extreme west are absolutely congruent. The time is congruent, and which culture was in Rigvedic people was the Harappan culture, and therefore he comes to a conclusion that the Rigvedic people were the inhabitants of the Harappan civilization. I mean, it's so geographically it matches, and in timelines it matches. So that was his book on Rigvedic people. The same is mentioned in chapter 2 over here. Chapter 3 talks about the hollowness of the Aryan invasion theory, which he again dismisses it in this chapter. Now, chapter 4. If you recall, the Aryan invasion theory was finally given up by certain scholars, certain section of scholars, and somewhere around middle of 80s, Romila Thapa said, okay, fine, we agree, if there's no invasion, then it must have been immigration. And this was immediately followed by Sri R.S. Sharma saying that the migration of Aryan people came from BMAC. Now, if you have a look at the BMAC, which is Bacteria Margiana Archaeological Complex, you'll find it is so advanced culturally that it could not be a civilization of pastoral cattle breeders, as they mentioned. And how can it, set of pastoral cattle breeder immigrants can teach Rigveda to a set of people covering 1.5 million square kilometers? So this immigration theory also went for a bunt after Professor Lal discussed the BMAC and its culture. And BMAC is post-Harappan, post-Rigvedic. On the next chapter is Professor Pozel's statements on Rigvedic flora and fauna as it came from a cold climate, and Professor Lal has proved that none of these were from cold climate, and they were from temperate climate, and he discusses each tree and each animal that is being discussed by Professor Pozel. Okay, the next chapter is on Aryans going west. You remember there's AIT, that Aryan vision theory, and then became OIT, out of India theory. The OIT is actually mentioned in Bodhayan Shatsutra, which in its text 18.44 says that the sons of Ayla, Pururvas, and Urvashi, named Ayu and Amavasu, migrated respectively to east and west. And Ayu migrated eastwards. Now notice the places that they migrated. Kuru, Panchal, Kurukshetra area, present-day Haryana, Panchal, and Kashi and Vidya, that's Varanasi towards east UP. The people who moved westwards were Gandhari, Parasu, and Aratta, which is Kandahar, Persia, and Turkey. So if they were to move from here, where were they located? Weren't they located between Gandhar and Kurukshetra, where again puts you in a slot where the Rigvedic people were. Clearly indicated that Rigvedic people were the ones who moved outside, and nobody came from outside to India. So that, and chapter 7 is about the continuity of Saraswati civilization. For the last 5,000 years, you have seen Sindoor, it was there. You have seen swastik, it was there in civilization. You have seen yoga, the terracottas have been found over there.
One is a map, which is so lovely. I mean, it's a beautiful map because it describes exactly the Indus Saraswati valley and the region in which this civilization existed. Alongside this, there is a mention which says that Bangza is an area in Turkey. And in that area, some tablets, clay tablets, have been found. This book is not mentioning, but read somewhere else. Hitani and Mitani people have entered into a treaty. And the witnesses to that treaty are Varun and Indra. Isn't that interesting? I mean, Varun and Indra can't be tracked to someone else other than us, because we continue to use these words even till date. So even origin of Sanskrit, and there's a huge thing about usurpation of knowledge. And that's what has happened with us. We continue to be very open-minded and open society where anyone can just walk in. We'll show where our literature is. We'll be happy to share all the information that we possess, sometimes show off how knowledgeable we are. But in the end, we are the ones who are giving out our knowledge to others who will rephrase the same thing without acknowledging that it all came from India. And that usurpation of Indian knowledge is what has happened. And in modern times, I laugh about it. But on a serious note, the haldi ka doodh, which we all get to drink because of our dadis and nanis and moms, becomes golden latte. And that's what has happened with all our civilizational values and systems. But this is an example just appropriate enough to bring back the fact that on daily basis, our knowledge gets usurped by others comes back to us in different forms and shapes, and we pay for it. The worst is we pay for it.
The idea that India may be the origin of world civilization in some form was actually anathema. Even though, interestingly, in the beginning of the 19th century, 100 years before that, it was actually commonly accepted. But through the course of the 19th century, as the Europeans came to dominate the world, they also came to come up with this idea that they themselves, in some fashion, were a pure race and source of civilization to the world in some fashion. And they, by the way, didn't just do this to us. They had similar theories in the rest of the world as well. For example, when in Zimbabwe they found a big site of a city, they came up with something called the Hamitic invasion theory, which suggested that people from the north must have come and settled here and set up this city. It couldn't possibly be these dark-looking people living there. Whereas we now know from more than adequate evidence that it was actually the local tribes who had built that city. So they did it everywhere. They did it in India as well. And so what is amusing is not so much that the Europeans, having done this colonial project and therefore having appropriated other people's civilization, including the symbol of the swastika, for their own imperial purposes. What is extraordinary is that 75 years after becoming independent, we're having to still establish this fact. But Dr. B.B. Lal, through his career, saw the debate also shift. It went with the Aryan invasion theory, then it became the Aryan migration theory, then it somewhat now has been diluted down to Aryan tourism theory. But I think the fact is that evidence has accumulated over time, which clearly strengthens the arguments he was making. And of course, he was somebody who was actually on the ground digging things up, not just quoting each other's texts, as many historians in India, post-independence India, have done. He was actually looking at primary evidence because he was digging it up. And so that is something that is an important part of what we now need to do, is to go and actually pull out the actual primary evidence. And so after a long break, after his pioneering excavations going back in the 50s and 60s, in the very recent past, we have begun to do new digs. And the findings from that are extraordinary. So not only are we finding out about the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization, we in fact are finding that the other parts of India also had other civilizations which had links to the Sindhu-Saraswati but were somewhat different. Just northeast of here, at Sanyal in the village, we have found remains of 2 chariots, which are the oldest chariots, by the way, in the world. There are no older chariots. There are 2 of them. One of them is rather well preserved. And the most important, interesting fact about the Sanyal chariots is, first of all, it's not in the northwest. It's actually in the Gangetic Plains. It's also, in some ways, should be common sense. I mean, even if the Aryans had chariots in Central Asia, if they were attempting to take them over the Hindu Kush and then through the riverine terrain, loamy soil of Punjab, they would have long abandoned it. I mean, a chariot is not very useful in hilly or wet terrain. It is only useful in flat terrain of Haryana and Western UP. So not surprisingly, the Kurukshetra war was fought in Haryana. If you go to the terrain of Kurukshetra, you'll see why it is a useful weapon there. It would simply not be very useful in Afghanistan. So, not surprisingly, that's the earliest chariots have been found here, going back to about 4,000 years ago. Also interesting is that this culture is actually an Eastern culture. This is the culture that is there from around Bagpat area, going eastward to about the Allahabad area. This is the culture that had it. We actually have very well preserved things, including swords, spears, shields, and other things that have been preserved from this culture. And it is a very warlike culture, but it is actually from the east, not from the northwest. So even if the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization was having military conflict with somebody, these were probably people more to the east of them, which would fit also many of the battles, like the Battle of 10 Kings. We know that the Bharatas fought with a battle on the banks of the Yamuna with a chieftain called Bheda, whom they defeated. And it also fits the fact that many of the Indus Saraswati sites are well fortified. So clearly this was a living culture, also a warlike culture. and certainly not somebody who would just get toppled over with ease by a small group of people coming in from the northwest, from Central Asia.